The sun was just coming up over the small town. The sky was soft and pink, and a cool breeze moved through the empty streets. Birds chirped in the trees, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from a nearby bakery. Everything seemed calm and peaceful. People were starting their day, opening their shops, and sweeping the sidewalks. Keanu Reeves walked down the street with his hands in his pockets. He wore a simple jacket and jeans, and his dark hair fell over his forehead. He looked like any other person, just enjoying the morning air. He wasn't in a hurry. He liked to take things slow and enjoy the little moments in life. Keanu wasn't just any man, though. He was kind and humble. He always smiled at people and helped whenever he could. Most people in town didn't know much about him. They just knew he was polite and friendly. But what they didn't know was that Keanu had a lot of experience dealing with difficult situations. He had traveled to many places, met many people, and learned how to stay calm under pressure. This morning, Keanu was heading to the small cafe at the corner of the street. It was his favorite place to sit and have a cup of coffee. The cafe was warm and cozy, with wooden tables and a friendly owner named Mrs. Lopez. She always greeted him with a big smile and a fresh cup of coffee. As he walked in, the bell above the door jingled. Mrs. Lopez looked up from behind the counter and smiled. "Good morning, Keanu." "Your usual?" she asked cheerfully. Keanu smiled back and nodded. "Good morning, Mrs. Lopez." "Yes, please." He sat down at his favorite table near the window. The sunlight poured in, making the whole place feel warm and peaceful. He took a deep breath, enjoying the smell of coffee and fresh pastries. People outside walked by, chatting and laughing. It was a normal morning, or so it seemed. Keanu liked quiet mornings like this. He enjoyed watching people and thinking about life. He was the kind of person who noticed the little things. He could tell if someone was sad just by looking at their eyes. He could hear things that others didn't, like the way someone's voice shook when they were nervous. He was good at reading people, but he never judged them. He believed everyone had a story. As he sipped his coffee, he saw a little boy outside struggling with his backpack. The bag was too heavy, and the boy looked frustrated. Keanu put down his cup, got up, and walked outside. "Need some help, buddy?" he asked gently. The boy looked up, surprised. Yeah, it's really heavy," he said shyly. Keanu knelt down and adjusted the straps on the backpack. "There you go. That should feel better," he said with a smile. The boy tried it again and smiled. "Thanks, mister." Keanu ruffled the boy's hair and watched him run off to school. He liked helping others. It made him happy to see people smile. Just as he turned to go back inside, something caught his eye. Across the street, a police car pulled up. A tall officer with dark sunglasses stepped out. His face was serious, and he looked around like he was searching for something. Keanu didn't think much of it at first. Police officers were always around, making sure everything was safe. But something felt different this time. The officer's eyes landed on Keanu, and he stared for a moment too long. Keanu felt a strange chill run down his spine. He wasn't doing anything wrong, so why was the officer looking at him like that? Keanu went back inside the cafe and sat down. He tried to ignore the feeling, but it stayed with him. Something was off. He took another sip of his coffee, trying to push away the uneasiness. A few minutes later, the door swung open with a loud creak. The police officer walked in, his boots clunking heavily on the wooden floor. The cafe suddenly felt smaller, and the warm, cozy feeling was gone. Mrs. Lopez looked up and gave a nervous smile. "Good morning, officer. What can I get you?" she asked. The officer didn't answer. He looked around, then walked straight to Keanu's table. Keanu stayed calm. He looked up and gave a polite smile. "Morning, officer. Can I help you?" Keanu asked in his usual friendly tone. The officer didn't smile back. Instead, he narrowed his eyes and placed his hand on his belt, where his gun rested. "You look suspicious," the officer said in a cold voice. "What are you doing here?" Keanu blinked in surprise. "Just having coffee," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Is something wrong?" The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at Keanu, as if trying to find something wrong with him. The cafe grew quiet. Other customers looked down at their cups, pretending not to notice, but Keanu could feel their eyes on him. Mrs. Lopez stepped forward nervously. "Officer, Keanu is a regular here." "He's a good man," she said softly. The officer ignored her. "Stand up," he ordered. Keanu's heart started beating a little faster, but he didn't let it show. He slowly stood up, raising his hands slightly to show he wasn't a threat. "There's no need for trouble," Keanu said gently. "I'm just having my morning coffee." The officer took a step closer, his hand still resting on his gun. "I'll decide if there's trouble," he said. Keanu could see the officer's jaw tighten. He knew this kind of situation could turn bad quickly, but he also knew how to stay calm. He had been in tough spots before. He didn't want to make things worse. "I understand, officer," Keanu said in a calm, steady voice. "But I promise you, I'm not doing anything wrong." Mrs. Lopez wrung her hands nervously behind the counter. "Please, officer. Keanu is a good person," she said again. The officer didn't seem to care. He grabbed his radio and mumbled something into it. Keanu knew he had to stay calm, but he also knew that sometimes, things didn't go the way they should, especially when people judged others without reason. Keanu looked around the cafe. He saw worried faces, and he knew that people were afraid to speak up. But he also knew that fear couldn't win. He had to handle this situation with patience and wisdom. Taking a deep breath, he looked the officer in the eyes. "Sir, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have," he said. "But I'd appreciate it if we could talk calmly." The officer hesitated for a moment, but before he could respond, the sound of another police car pulling up outside made everyone turn toward the window. The morning that had started so peacefully was now filled with tension. Keanu knew this was only the beginning of something much bigger. Keanu Reeves sat quietly at his favorite table in the small cafe. He enjoyed the warm coffee in his hands. The morning was peaceful, and the soft chatter of people filled the air. Outside, cars passed by slowly, and the bright sun lit up the streets. It seemed like just another normal day. But suddenly, the sound of police sirens cut through the air. The noise was loud and sharp. People in the cafe turned their heads to look outside. A police car pulled up quickly, stopping right in front of the cafe. The door swung open, and a tall police officer stepped out. He wore dark sunglasses and had a serious look on his face. His uniform was neat, and his boots made a heavy sound as he walked. Keanu watched as the officer stood outside for a moment, looking around. The officer's eyes stopped on him. Keanu felt the gaze, sharp and heavy, like the officer was searching for something. Mrs. Lopez, the cafe owner, wiped her hands on her apron and looked worried. "What's going on?" she whispered to no one in particular. The officer pushed open the cafe door with force, making the bell above it jingle loudly. The whole cafe went silent. People stopped talking, and the air felt tense. The officer walked straight toward Keanu's table, his face stern and unkind. Keanu looked up, calm but alert. "Good morning, officer," he said politely. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he stood over Keanu, looking down at him. "You look suspicious," the officer said in a cold voice. Keanu blinked. "Suspicious?" he repeated, keeping his voice calm. "I'm just having my coffee." The officer crossed his arms and frowned. "Stand up," he ordered. Keanu glanced around the cafe. Everyone was watching, but nobody spoke. Mrs. Lopez's hands trembled as she held onto the counter. Keanu nodded and slowly stood up. Is there a problem, officer? He asked gently. The officer narrowed his eyes. We got a call about someone causing trouble, he said. You match the description. Keanu frowned slightly but stayed calm. I'm just sitting here, drinking my coffee, he said. Maybe there's been a mistake. The officer's hand moved to his belt, where his gun rested. Are you saying I'm wrong? He asked in a hard voice. Keanu could see the officer's fingers tapping against the holster. He knew this situation could get worse if he didn't stay calm. He took a deep breath, keeping his hands where the officer could see them. I'm not saying that, Keanu said kindly. I just think we should talk about this. Mrs. Lopez stepped forward nervously. Officer, Keanu comes here all the time, she said. He's a good man. He wouldn't hurt anyone. The officer ignored her and took a step closer to Keanu. Do you have ID? He asked. Keanu reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed his ID to the officer, who snatched it quickly and looked at it. The officer muttered, his face still serious. He stared at the ID for a long moment, then looked back at Keanu. Keanu kept his voice calm. I understand you're doing your job, he said. But I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm just enjoying my morning. The officer smirked. You think you're smart, don't you? He said. People like you always have something to hide. Keanu's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't respond to the officer's harsh words. Instead, he stayed quiet and respectful. He had learned long ago that staying calm was the best way to handle situations like this. Mrs. Lopez stepped in again. Officer, please, she said softly. Keanu is a regular customer. He helps people in this neighborhood. The officer looked at her, then back at Keanu. We'll see about that, he said. Suddenly, another officer walked into the cafe. This one looked younger and seemed less tense. Hey, Officer Gray, he said, nodding to the first officer. What's going on? I found our guy, Officer Gray said, pointing at Keanu. The younger officer looked at Keanu and frowned. I don't think this is the right person, he said. I just got an update on the call. The suspect was last seen wearing a red jacket, not a black one. Keanu looked down at his black jacket and sighed softly. I told you, officer, he said. I think there's been a mistake. Officer Gray's face turned red with frustration. He glanced at Mrs. Lopez, who was still standing nervously by the counter, and then back at Keanu. Fine, Officer Gray said gruffly. You're free to go, for now. He handed Keanu's ID back roughly and turned on his heel. Without another word, he stomped out of the cafe, his boots echoing loudly. The younger officer gave Keanu an apologetic look. Sorry about that, he said before following his partner out. The door closed behind them, and the cafe fell silent. Everyone let out a sigh of relief. Mrs. Lopez walked over and patted Keanu's shoulder. I'm so sorry you had to go through that, she said softly. Keanu smiled gently. It's okay, he said. It happens sometimes. A man sitting at a nearby table shook his head. It shouldn't happen, he said. You were just sitting here, minding your own business. Keanu nodded. You're right, he said. But getting angry wouldn't have helped. He sat back down and took another sip of his coffee, even though it had gone cold. His heart was still beating a little fast, but he didn't let it show. He had faced worse situations before, and he knew how to handle them. Mrs. Lopez brought him a fresh cup of coffee and smiled warmly. This one's on the house, she said. Keanu smiled back. Thanks, Mrs. Lopez. The cafe slowly returned to normal. People started talking again, and the air felt lighter. But deep down, Keanu knew something was wrong. He had seen the look in Officer Gray's eyes. It wasn't just about a mistaken call. It was something more. And Keanu had a feeling that this wasn't over yet. Keanu Reeves sat quietly in the cafe, staring at his cup of coffee. The cafe was busy again, and people were talking and laughing, but he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened earlier. The police officer, Officer Gray, had accused him of something he didn't do. It didn't feel right. Keanu had a feeling that there was more to this than just a simple mistake. He took a deep breath and looked out the window. The streets were filled with people going about their day, but Keanu knew that not everyone felt safe. If this could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. He couldn't just let it go. He needed to find out if Officer Gray had done this to other people too. Mrs. Lopez walked over and placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. "You okay, Keanu?" she asked with a kind smile. Keanu nodded slowly. "I don't know, Mrs. Lopez," he said. "Something doesn't feel right. That officer, he didn't even listen to me." Mrs. Lopez sighed and sat down across from him. "I've seen him do this before," she said quietly. "He's been bothering people around here for a long time. But no one knows what to do about it." Keanu frowned. "Why hasn't anyone said anything?" Mrs. Lopez shook her head. "People are scared, Keanu. They don't want trouble." Keanu understood. He felt the same way, but he also knew that someone had to stand up. "Maybe it's time we do something," he said firmly. Mrs. Lopez looked at him with hope in her eyes. "What are you thinking?" Keanu thought for a moment. "I need to talk to people," he said. "I need to find out if this has happened to others. If we have proof, we can do something about it." Mrs. Lopez nodded. "I know some people who might be able to help. There's Mr. Johnson, who runs the grocery store. He's had problems with Officer Gray before. And Maria from the flower shop, she's always worried about him bothering her customers." Keanu smiled. "That's a good start." The next day, Keanu walked down the street to Mr. Johnson's grocery store. The old man was stacking apples on a shelf when Keanu walked in. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," Keanu said politely. Mr. Johnson looked up and smiled. "Morning, Keanu. What can I do for you?" Keanu hesitated for a moment, then said, "I need to ask you something. Has Officer Gray ever given you trouble?" Mr. Johnson's smile faded. He put down the apples and sighed. "That man, he comes in here all the time, looking for problems that don't exist. He accused my nephew of stealing once, just because he looked suspicious." Keanu frowned. "Did anything happen?" Mr. Johnson shook his head. "No proof, of course. But it scared my nephew. He hasn't been the same since." Keanu nodded. "Thanks for telling me, Mr. Johnson. I'm trying to gather stories. I think if we all speak up, we can do something." Mr. Johnson patted Keanu on the shoulder. "You're a good man, Keanu. Let me know if you need anything." Keanu left the store feeling more determined. He visited Maria next, at the flower shop. Maria was busy arranging a bouquet when he walked in. "Hi, Maria," Keanu greeted. "Hi, Keanu," she said with a smile. "What brings you here?" Keanu hesitated, then said, "I wanted to ask about Officer Gray. Has he ever caused problems for you?" Maria's face turned serious. "Oh, yes," she said. "He's always watching my shop. My customers feel uncomfortable when he stands outside, staring in. I've even lost some business because of it." Keanu nodded. "I think it's time we do something about it." Maria sighed. "I hope so. He's been getting away with this for too long." Keanu knew that gathering stories was important, but he needed someone who knew the law. He decided to visit his friend, Mr. Patel, a lawyer who had an office nearby. Mr. Patel was kind and always willing to help people. When Keanu walked into the office, Mr. Patel looked up and smiled. "Keanu. What a surprise. Come in, sit down." Keanu sat down and explained everything: how Officer Gray had treated him unfairly, how others in the community had the same problem, and how he wanted to stop it. Mr. Patel listened carefully, then nodded. Keanu, what you're doing is important. If Officer Gray is abusing his power, he needs to be held accountable. Keanu frowned. But how do we do that? Mr. Patel leaned forward. First, we need evidence. Stories from people are good, but we need something solid like video recordings or written reports. We should also report this to the local police department and the town council. Keanu sighed. That sounds like a lot. Mr. Patel smiled. Don't worry. You're not alone. I'll help you. Keanu felt a little better. Thanks, Mr. Patel. I really appreciate it. That night, Keanu sat alone in his small apartment, thinking about everything. He knew he was doing the right thing, but he couldn't help feeling nervous. What if Officer Gray found out? What if people were too scared to come forward? He thought about his past and how he had always tried to do the right thing. But this felt bigger than anything he had faced before. He sighed and looked at his reflection in the window. Am I really ready for this? He whispered to himself. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Maria. Thank you for helping us, Keanu. We believe in you. Keanu smiled. He wasn't alone. People were counting on him, and he wouldn't let them down. The next day, Keanu and Mr. Patel sat in the cafe, going through all the information they had collected. They had written statements from Mr. Johnson, Maria, and a few other people in the neighborhood. We need to present this to the police department, Mr. Patel said. And if they don't listen, we take it to the news. Keanu nodded. Let's do it. Just then, the door to the cafe opened, and Officer Gray walked in. He looked around and saw Keanu sitting with Mr. Patel. He frowned and walked over. What's going on here? Officer Gray asked suspiciously. Keanu looked him in the eye, his voice calm but firm. We're just having a talk, officer. Officer Gray narrowed his eyes. You better watch yourself, Reeves. Keanu didn't flinch. I always do, officer. As Officer Gray walked away, Mrs. Lopez whispered, Be careful, Keanu. Keanu smiled. I will. He knew the fight wasn't over, but he was ready for it. The sun was setting over the small town, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. Keanu Reeves stood outside the cafe, his heart beating fast but his face calm. He knew tonight was important. Tonight, he would face Officer Gray and show everyone the truth. For the past few days, Keanu had been gathering stories from people in town. Many of them had been treated badly by Officer Gray. Some were scared to talk, but others were brave enough to share their stories. With the help of Mr. Patel, the lawyer, Keanu had collected enough proof. They had written statements, pictures, and even a few videos showing Officer Gray acting unfairly. Keanu took a deep breath and looked at Mrs. Lopez, who stood beside him. Are you ready? He asked. Mrs. Lopez nodded nervously. I hope this works, Keanu. We need to stop him. Keanu smiled. We will. Together, they walked toward the town hall, where a community meeting was being held. The room was full of people, shop owners, neighbors, and even a few police officers. Everyone was talking quietly, wondering what would happen. At the front of the room, Officer Gray stood tall with his arms crossed. He looked confident, but Keanu could see the small frown on his face. He knew something was coming. Keanu walked to the front of the room and cleared his throat. Excuse me, everyone, he said. The room grew quiet. I know many of you are here because you've seen things that don't feel right, Keanu continued. We all want to live in a safe and fair town. But lately, some things have happened that are not fair at all. Officer Gray smirked. What are you talking about, Reeves? He said loudly. Are you wasting everyone's time? Keanu stayed calm. No, officer. I'm talking about how you've been treating people unfairly. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people nodded, while others looked surprised. Keanu held up a small stack of papers. "I have proof," he said firmly. "Proof that you have been stopping innocent people for no reason. Proof that you have been scaring business owners and hurting our community." Officer Gray's smile disappeared. His face turned red. "That's nonsense," he snapped. "I'm just doing my job." Keanu shook his head. "Doing your job means protecting people, not scaring them." He looked at the crowd. "Mr. Johnson, would you like to speak?" Mr. Johnson, the grocery store owner, stood up slowly. "A few months ago, Officer Gray accused my nephew of stealing. He didn't do anything wrong, but Officer Gray wouldn't listen." Then Maria from the flower shop spoke. "He always stands outside my shop, staring at my customers. People feel nervous, and I've lost business because of it." One by one, more people stood up, sharing their stories. Officer Gray looked around the room, his hands tightening into fists. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "You don't have any real proof." Keanu smiled slightly. "Actually, we do." He reached into his bag and pulled out a small laptop. He pressed a button, and a video started playing on a big screen. The video showed Officer Gray stopping a young man on the street, asking him harsh questions for no reason. Another video showed him yelling at a woman in the grocery store. There were several clips, all showing the same thing: Officer Gray using his power unfairly. The room fell silent. People watched in shock. Some gasped, while others shook their heads in anger. Officer Gray's face turned pale. This is fake," he stuttered. Keanu shook his head. "No, Officer Gray. These are real videos from real people. And it's time for this to stop." The police chief, who had been sitting quietly in the back, stood up. He looked at the screen, then at Officer Gray. "Gray, we need to talk," he said in a firm voice. Officer Gray backed away, his eyes wide with fear. I didn't do anything wrong," he shouted. But no one believed him anymore. Two officers stepped forward and led Officer Gray out of the room. The crowd started clapping. Some people cheered. Mrs. Lopez wiped tears from her eyes and hugged Keanu. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." Keanu smiled. "We did it," he said, looking at all the people around him. "We stood together." The police chief walked up to Keanu and shook his hand. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention," he said. "We will investigate further, and I promise you, things will change." As Keanu left the town hall, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had faced his fear, and he had done the right thing. The town was safer now, and people felt stronger knowing they could stand up for themselves. Mrs. Lopez walked beside him, smiling. "So, what's next, Keanu?" she asked. Keanu laughed softly. "I think I'll just enjoy my coffee for now." But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. There were always people who needed help, and Keanu would be ready when they did. The morning after the big meeting at the town hall, the sun shone brightly over the little town. Everything felt different. People were smiling, and there was a sense of relief in the air. Keanu Reeves walked down the street, feeling proud but also tired. He had worked hard to bring the truth out, and now things were finally changing. Mrs. Lopez stood outside her cafe, wiping the windows. When she saw Keanu, she waved happily. "Good morning, Keanu," she called. Keanu smiled back. "Morning, Mrs. Lopez. How are you feeling today?" Mrs. Lopez sighed with relief. "Much better. It feels good to know that Officer Gray won't be bothering us anymore." Everyone in town had heard the news. Officer Gray had been fired from his job after the meeting. The police chief had promised to look into all the complaints, and it was clear that Officer Gray had been treating people unfairly for a long time. The town was happy that justice had been served. Keanu sat down at his usual table inside the cafe, and Mrs. Lopez brought him a hot cup of coffee. "This one is on the house," she said with a smile. "You deserve it." Keanu took a sip and nodded. Thanks, Mrs. Lopez. But I didn't do this alone. It was all of us working together. Mrs. Lopez patted his shoulder. Maybe, but you gave us the courage to speak up. As Keanu looked around the cafe, he saw familiar faces. Mr. Johnson from the grocery store waved at him from the counter, and Maria from the flower shop smiled as she walked past. They all felt safer now. No more fear, no more looking over their shoulders. In the days that followed, things started to change. The police department set up meetings with the community to listen to their concerns. They promised to be more fair and kind to everyone. People felt more comfortable walking the streets, knowing they wouldn't be stopped for no reason anymore. Keanu noticed that Maria's flower shop had more customers now. She no longer looked nervous standing outside. Mr. Johnson's nephew even came back to help at the grocery store, feeling safe again. One afternoon, Keanu was sitting in the park when Mr. Patel, the lawyer, came to sit next to him. You did a good thing, Keanu, Mr. Patel said. Keanu shrugged. I just wanted to help. Mr. Patel smiled. And you did. But remember, there will always be challenges. We have to keep standing up for what's right. Keanu nodded. I know. I'll be ready. Even though things were better now, Keanu couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if he hadn't spoken up. He thought about the times he felt scared, wondering if anyone would believe him. It wasn't easy, but he had learned that doing the right thing was worth it. One evening, as he sat on his porch, Mrs. Lopez came by with a basket of cookies. She sat down next to him and looked at the sunset. Keanu, she said softly, I never told you this, but I was scared to run my cafe before. I was afraid that if I said something about Officer Gray, things would get worse. But you showed me that being brave is the only way to make things better. Keanu smiled at her words. It's not always easy to be brave, he said. But sometimes, you just have to do it. Mrs. Lopez nodded. Yes. And now, we all know we can. A few days later, Keanu received a phone call from the town mayor. Keanu, the mayor said, we've been impressed by your work in the community. We'd like you to help with a new project to make the town a better place. Keanu was surprised. Me? What kind of project? The mayor chuckled. Helping people feel safe and heard. We want to create a community group that listens to people's problems and makes sure things like this don't happen again. Keanu thought about it for a moment. He had always liked helping others, and this was a great way to keep making a difference. I'd be happy to help, he said. With this new opportunity, Keanu knew his work wasn't done. There were still things to improve in the town. He wanted to make sure no one felt scared again. He also wanted to teach others how to stand up for themselves. As he walked down the street, he saw kids playing and laughing in the park. Families were shopping happily, and the air felt lighter. Keanu felt proud to be a part of this change. Before heading home, he stopped by Maria's flower shop. Hey, Maria, he said. How's business? Maria smiled brightly. Better than ever, thanks to you. Keanu laughed. No, thanks to all of us. Maria handed him a small flower. Here, for good luck in whatever you do next. Keanu took the flower and smiled. Thanks, Maria. I think I'm going to need it. Keanu knew that standing up against wrong things wasn't easy, but it was important. He hoped that everyone in the town had learned that too. That evening, he sat on his porch, looking up at the stars. He thought about everything that had happened, the fear, the doubt, and finally, the victory. He realized something important: one person could make a difference, but when people came together, they could do anything. As he sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Patel. The town is better because of you, Keanu. Let's keep working. Keanu smiled and typed back, of course. We're just getting started. Even though things were better now, Keanu knew there would always be more work to do. He had learned that fighting for what's right is a journey, not just a one-time thing. As the town settled into its new, fairer way of life, Keanu looked forward to the future. What challenges would come next? He didn't know. But one thing was certain: he would be ready. And so, as the sun set over the little town, Keanu Reeves smiled, knowing that his fight for justice had only just begun.